Welcome to this edition of the Housing Ombudsman Service podcast. I'm Victoria King, one of the sector learning and development leads here at the Housing Ombudsman Service. And today I'm joined by Ruth Venables, one of our investigators in our dispute resolution team here at the Housing Ombudsman Service. Hello, Ruth. Would you like to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your role and what does your department do here at the Housing Ombudsman Service?
So hello, I am an investigator working in dispute resolution and I have been since October 2023. My role is to investigate a complaint between a landlord and a resident. I investigate to decide what is fair and reasonable based on the evidence that I have received. I look to see if the landlord has done things right and followed its policies and procedures correctly. If it's not got things right, that would lead to an adverse finding. And if we find an adverse finding, then we ask the landlord to put things right, which can come in many different forms.
This is one of our Casework Conversations podcasts, and we're here to talk about a case you worked on earlier this year, which some of our listeners may have seen already as we shared this on social media. The case was a complaint about how the landlord handled cracked ceilings in a resident's home and the compensation that the landlord awarded. Ruth, can you tell us more about the background to this case?
Yeah, so the resident in this case, she moved into the property on the 11th of November 2022. It was a 3-bedroomed house, and at the time of the complaint, the resident had 3 children and she was pregnant with her 4th. On the 8th of December 2022, so not long after she moved in, the resident reported cracks in her ceilings, which the landlord attended to inspect. After the inspection, the landlord decided that it needed to replace the cracked ceilings, and then to minimise future disruption to the resident and her family, it said it would also replace the other ceilings in the property, including in all the bedrooms, the hall and the landing. It began the works on the 9th of January 2023, and at that time it temporarily rehoused the resident to a fully furnished property just close to where her home was.
So the landlord finished the work on the resident's home by the 1st of February 2023, but because she had her baby while she was living in the temporary housing and following contact from her support worker, the landlord actually extended the period she could stay in that temporary home until the 10th of February 2023, and then again until the 15th of February 2023. And during that time, the work was happening on her home. The resident raised a formal complaint, and that was raised in mid-January 2023. Can you tell us more about the complaint?
Yeah, so like you say, the resident raised the complaint. It was on the 19th of January 2023, and that was about the landlord's handling of the removal of the ceilings and her concerns about asbestos in the property and any potential impact of the asbestos with the removal of the ceilings.
So the resident called the landlord to raise the complaint and about how it was handling the removal of the ceiling and that asbestos. The landlord issued its stage 1 response in early February 2023. What did the response cover?
Yeah, so in that stage 1 response, the landlord gave a brief overview of the history of the complaint, and it confirmed that during the works it had agreed to replace the 2 other ceilings in the property, thereby minimising any further disruption to the resident. It reassured the resident that an earlier survey of the property had found asbestos, but the risk to the resident was low. And it confirmed that it had also undertaken a further air test on the 27th of January 2023, after it had finished all the works, which had shown no asbestos in the air, and it provided a copy of that with the response. The landlord did empathise with the residents' concerns, but it said it hoped it had taken steps to reassure her that the home was safe. And it concluded the response by confirming that the property was due for a final inspection and sign-off on the 8th of February 2023.
Thank you, Ruth. Yeah, so we talk about asbestos management in our Learning from Severe Maladministration report, which we released in March 2025, and it's on our website if those listening want to check that out. Asbestos is a hazard under the HHSRS, which, along with other legislation, contributes to a landlord's overall duty to manage asbestos in its homes. So landlords should be identifying if asbestos is present, doing a survey, identifying the location of that asbestos in the property and seeing how vulnerable it is to damage, and then looking at any current damage or potential fibre release, because obviously it's really, really dangerous. If there is asbestos, it doesn't automatically mean that a property is actually in disrepair, as actually often asbestos can be safely managed by landlords in situ, provided that it's covered up, it's in good condition, and it's unlikely to be damaged or disturbed. So, as with all safety and hazard related topics, good records, we're always talking about this, having good records, and giving accurate information and openly communicating with residents is so important, because it is an alarming thing to live with in a home, particularly if you've got children there, or the occupants have health conditions. Right, so back to this case then. The resident wasn't pleased with the stage 1 response from the landlord. And responded to the landlord following the stage 1 response the same day. Why was she unhappy?
So she wasn't happy because she didn't feel that the landlord had taken her concerns seriously. She said that the cracks were evident in the property prior to her moving in. She said that the landlord had made her feel like the issues were her fault and that it had basically done her a favour by completing the works. And then, secondly, as part of the repairs process, the landlord had repainted some of the rooms in the property as a gesture of goodwill. But the resident was unhappy because she had paid £300 for the rooms to be decorated before the ceilings were replaced, and she basically wanted the landlord to refund her that money.
So she was told that the asbestos was only in the roof. The landlord had given her the report when she moved in, but she said she hadn't thought to read it. The landlord gave its stage 2 response a few days after the stage 1 response. Can you tell us more about what that stage 2 response said?
So in its stage 2 response, the landlord accepted that the situation had been difficult for the resident, but it confirmed that it had let the property to her in accordance with its void standard. It kind of reiterated that it had acted quickly following the reporting of the cracks, and to avoid any future disruption to the resident, it had replaced all the ceilings and decorated the house. To help alleviate the residents' concerns about the asbestos, it also commissioned the further air tests, which had come back clear. It confirmed to the resident that it had extended her temporary accommodation by a further week to help with her moving back in. And because by that point she'd had her fourth baby, and then it also offered her a £500 disruption payment.
So what happened next then in this case?
So following that response, the resident was still unhappy with the landlord and how it had handled the repairs and the whole situation. She was unhappy with the compensation it had offered, and she just reiterated that she'd felt that she'd lost the £300 that she'd previously paid for the decorating. She spoke about the impact the disruption had on her and her family. And in response to that, the landlord didn't change its position. It just reiterated the steps that it had taken to resolve the situation for the resident, including that it had redecorated and offered her the £500 to recognise the disruption to her and her family.
So the case then comes to us at the Housing Ombudsman Service, and you're investigating it. What did you look at with regards to the landlord's policies and procedures?
Yeah, so in this case, first thing I looked at was the landlord's lettable standards document, which highlighted that the landlord would inspect a property prior to any resident moving in to ensure that property was structurally sound. And then secondly, I looked at the landlord's repairs policy, which highlighted that it would attend to emergency repairs within 24 hours and then routine repairs within 28 days.
So since this case was investigated and this situation happened, obviously OWOB's laws come in now. So the policy in hindsight was in line with what OWOB's laws does say, and making sure that any emergency hazards are safe within 24 hours. Now, in this case, you also looked at what happened in relation to the repairs to the ceiling. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so when the resident first reported the cracks in the ceiling, the landlord attended in line with its repairs policy to inspect the ceiling. It was following that it obviously discovered that it needed to replace some of the ceilings. And then, as we know, in this case, the landlord also decided that the ceilings, which hadn't yet shown any signs of cracking, should be replaced at the same time to minimise any future disruption. It began replacing the ceiling 19 days after the surveyor had identified the need for the works, which was obviously well within its 28-day published timescale for completing repairs. I think in this case, the swift response was particularly important because the resident was pregnant at the time. And then it also arranged for her temporary accommodation for her and her family, which it provided fully furnished, and it was still within close proximity to the home. During the works, the landlord kind of considered the bigger picture and obviously replaced the other ceilings that it didn't need to replace at the time. And its decision to do those repairs really highlighted its commitment to minimise disruption for the resident. And it did show its commitment to keeping its properties in a good condition, kind of future-proofing them. The landlord completed all the repairs and redecorating by the 27th of January, which again, was a swift response. And as during that time the resident had given birth, the landlord extended the period of time that she could stay in the temporary accommodation by a further week. Then following that, the resident raised further concerns about moving back to the property so soon after giving birth. So just to give her a little bit more time, it extended the accommodation again by a further week. And then during the period of time between it completing the works and the resident moving back in, she'd obviously gone back to the property. I think she was moving stuff back in piecemeal, and said to the landlord that its operatives had left dust all over her belongings. And in recognising that obviously that's quite distressing to the resident, the landlord arranged to attend and complete a deep clean. And obviously it's not ideal for the property to have been left in that condition at all, but it was in line with our dispute resolution principles that the landlord arranged for the clean prior to her moving back in. Overall, in this case, when you look at the landlord's actions, it responded quickly when the resident first reported the issue. It arranged for temporary accommodation in the locality. It completed the works in a timely manner, including going above and beyond the works identified, and extended the accommodation following the resident giving birth, giving her more time to move back into our home. And then obviously it also redecorated every room in the property, which I think, given the residents' particular circumstances, having 3 children and having just given birth, was reasonable. And then as well as that, it completed the air test to reassure her that the property was safe, and then completed that deep clean so that when she did move back in, she could just move back in and it was ready to go.
So that was your investigation into the report of cracks in the ceiling, where you found no maladministration. The resident responded to the landlord's stage 1 complaint reply to say she'd spent £300 on decorating the house before the landlord did the ceiling works, and she wasn't happy that the landlord hadn't refunded that £300. What did you find when you investigated that element?
So it was unfortunate timing, I think, in this case, that the resident had decorated the property prior to the ceilings being replaced. But the landlord did redecorate every room in the house. And I think, given that it had done that, and it was under no obligation to do so, it wouldn't have been fair or reasonable for us to ask the landlord to reimburse the costs that the resident had asked for. I felt that in redecorating the whole property, the landlord had recognised the disruption caused, and actually that was enough in this case.
Can you tell us more about the asbestos in the resident's home and what you looked at in this investigation in relation to the asbestos?
Yeah, so the landlord in this case confirmed that it had completed an asbestos test in the property in 2022. And at that time, it had found the asbestos to be low risk. And it had provided that information to the resident at the time she had taken up the tenancy. And the resident did admit that she actually hadn't read that document when she moved in. Because of that, we can't hold a landlord responsible when a resident has not read the information that they've been provided with. Following the resident raising her complaint, when she raised the concerns about the asbestos, the landlord arranged for a specialist asbestos contractor to complete the repairs in the property. And while the risk was deemed low, it was appropriate of it to use a specialist in this instance, given we know the known dangers of disturbing asbestos. Following it completing the works, it then undertook the further air tests in the property just to give the resident reassurance that it was safe. The resident was concerned, obviously she had children, including a newborn, and it was appropriate of the landlord to undertake that test. And it really highlighted to me that it did take her concerns seriously.
Throughout the complaint, the resident said that the landlord should not have let the property in the standard that it was in. What did you find out about this element of the complaint during your investigation, in your investigation?
Yeah, so the evidence in this case showed that the landlord had undertaken an inspection of the property when it was empty, and the property had been signed off as being of a lettable good standard. I was unable to say if the cracks had appeared before or after that inspection, but the landlord is entitled to rely on its qualified staff when they complete such inspections and sign off a property. It's important, I think, to note in this case that the landlord did act swiftly to rectify the issue as soon as it became aware of it. And the evidence did show that it reiterated the importance of completing inspections during the void process to its staff. And in this instance, I don't think you could ask for more from a landlord.
So, to recognise the disruption caused to the resident, the landlord offered the resident £500 compensation. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, so the £500 compensation, the landlord offset that against the resident's rent account because she was in arrears at the time of the complaint. Its decision to do that was in line with its compensation policy, which said it would take such action where a resident was in arrears. As we know, part of the resident's complaint was in relation to the amount of compensation that it offered. And I found in this case that there was no maladministration with regards to that amount. The actions taken by the landlord in this case were swift and appropriate. And in offering the £500, I felt that it was an amount that actually accurately reflected the impact on the resident.
We found no maladministration in this case on the part of the landlord. Can you just summarise for us what good practice the landlord demonstrated in this case?
Yeah, so the landlord inspected and repaired the property within its published timescales. It moved the resident to a fully furnished home close by. As the resident was due to give birth close to the move, the landlord extended the temporary accommodation to minimise the disruption to her and her family. When the landlord found out about the further issues with the cleaning and the dust in the property, deep cleaned the home to ensure that it was clean, as well as arranging for an air test to check for the asbestos levels to make sure that it was safe for the resident and her family to return and provide that reassurance to her. And then it also redecorated every room in the house. All of that together really highlighted its commitment to put things right for the resident.
So we're highlighting this case because there was no maladministration in the landlord's handling of the cracks in the ceiling or in the compensation awarded. Clearly it acted really quickly, swiftly. It arranged for a survey. It began works within its policy timescales. And as you said there, Ruth, it appropriately arranged for temporary housing within the locality, and it extended that stay twice because of the residents' personal circumstances. So it really just showed that a holistic, tailored to individual circumstances approach. It also did extra work on the home, which did, although it did make the decant, the temporary stay in a different house longer, it was actually trying to reduce the need for possible further disruption in the future. And also, like you said, it did do that deep clean of the home, decorated every room. It did those extra air tests to make sure that the home was safe and to reassure the resident as well. And that does really show a commitment to resolve the situation quickly. And, as I've mentioned just a moment ago, it does show that the landlord thought about the residents' individual circumstances and adapted its service accordingly. Now, I've got a quote because this was published on social media. We've got a quote here from our ombudsman, Richard Blakeway. He said the landlord demonstrated throughout that it was sensitive to the residents' circumstances. It focused on the resident's pregnancy to ensure that its work did not adversely impact the resident at this important time. So that brings us to the end of the podcast today, Ruth. Thank you so much for your time to discuss this case, and thank you to those who have listened to this podcast. You can find out more about our decisions. They're published on our website, and you can check out more of our podcasts on our website too. and that is at www.housing-ombudsman.org.uk. And if you're a member landlord of the Housing Ombudsman scheme, you can also get exclusive access to our Centre for Learning Landlord Hub, details of which you can also find on our website. So thanks again for listening, and thank you again, Ruth, for taking the time to discuss this case with us.